Education Minnesota, harnessing the power of our state's professional educators to make positive change and meaningful improvements for students, our profession, public education, and our communities. Coming together in union, our members include teachers and education support professionals in Minnesota's public school districts, faculty members at Minnesota's community and technical colleges, and at the University of Minnesota campuses in Duluth and Crookston. Retired educators and aspiring educators, we raise our collective voice for quality education for each other and for the future. We help build better lives for all working people. Education Minnesota is affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, two strong national unions with members in many states. And we are part of the AFL-CIO, a broad coalition of labor and worker organizations across many industries. Our union has a proud history built on a remarkable legacy of action, advocacy, and leadership. Minnesota educators enjoy better pay, pensions, and working conditions because previous generations fought for them together. We recognize our responsibility to defend past victories for students and educators and to win our own in union, continuing our legacy of leadership. Some of the most challenging but exciting times for educators and union members lie in the years ahead. To see where we're going, we should reflect on where we've been. So it's useful to look back at the nearly 160-year history of educator unions in Minnesota and the 20 years and counting story of the single most powerful voice for educators in our state's history. Education Minnesota.
In 1858, when Minnesota became a state, the notion of public education as a right was still very new. In those days, an educated person was someone who had completed elementary school. Anyone who could read, write, and do simple arithmetic had all the education necessary to succeed in life. The state's first teachers, like St. Paul's Harriet Bishop, faced special challenges. Her first classroom was a converted blacksmith shop. Soon, however, Minnesota committed to making its citizens some of the best educated in the nation, a ranking it still holds today. After achieving statehood, the legislature established what was then the largest permanent school fund in the nation. Many of the first teachers had no education beyond high school, but as support grew across the state for public schools, so too did the commitment to treating educators as professionals. 6 normal schools, as they were called, were founded to train teachers, starting in 1860 with the Normal School in Winona. They later became state teachers' colleges, and then simply state colleges. Educators themselves decided they needed to organize to increase their professional growth and development. They also recognized the need to advocate for public education. In August of 1861, some 100 people gathered in Rochester to form the Minnesota State Teachers Association, later to become the Minnesota Education Association, one of the predecessors to the union we have today. For 137 years, MEA was a champion of quality in teaching, curriculum, administration, and public education legislation. From the beginning, educators organized at the local level. They formed associations, later to become local unions, to represent them and to address their concerns in their school districts and workplaces. These early activists knew that better schools are directly related to improvements in the teaching profession. MEA advocated for stringent teacher certification standards, which were adopted in Minnesota starting in the 1860s. Delegates to early MEA conventions debated a variety of important subjects, from school curriculum and libraries to discipline in the classroom. Members of the MEA also played an important role in the formation of the National Education Association. For 25 years, the NEA's national headquarters was in Winona. MEA members knew the quality of education was tied to their collective ability to improve wages and working conditions. While more was being demanded of educators, their harder effort was not being rewarded. Many became frustrated at the lack of progress. Often school districts had no salary schedule, an administrator could decide each teacher's pay raise, if any, without having to justify the decision. Numerous school buildings were run down and poorly lit with inadequate heat, ventilation, and sanitation. Teachers who didn't like the working conditions were often told, "If you don't like it, leave." Instead, they organized. Starting in 1918 in St. Paul, some affiliates of the MEA broke away and joined the newly formed American Federation of Teachers, which was part of the American Federation of Labor. These mostly urban educators believed teachers had more in common with the larger labor movement than with the school administrators who led other teachers' groups. The activism among teachers coincided with a growing movement by many workers to organize. In the 1800s, as the nation grew and industrialized and railroads linked cities from coast to coast, union membership increased as well. The nation's first millionaires, men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, prospered, while many of the workers who built their empires lived in deplorable conditions. Starting in the 1880s, working people began to rebel against these robber barons. They fought for an 8-hour workday, safer workplaces, and an end to child labor. By the 1930s, workers were organizing into unions by the millions every year in textile mills, steel plants, and auto factories. Minnesota was a hotbed for union activity, led by the Steelworkers Campaign in the Iron Range mines and the difficult and bloody strikes to unionize truckers and warehouse workers in Minneapolis. Their efforts created the middle-class standard of living that enabled many Minnesotans to own their homes, send their children to college, and retire in security. In this atmosphere, the Minnesota Federation of Teachers continued to press its twin goals of stronger public education and better wages and working conditions for educators. Members held rallies and handed out leaflets. They talked to lawmakers and wrote letters to their local newspapers. Some even went on strike. Walking off the job for any worker, but especially a public school teacher, was risky business. In 1935, as thousands of workers demonstrated demanding a voice on the job, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act. The NLRA made it the policy of the United States to encourage collective bargaining. It set up a process for most workers in the private sector to form unions, negotiate contracts, and strike if necessary. However, the NLRA did not extend to public school employees or others who worked in federal, state, and local government. So when St. Paul public school teachers walked off the job in the fall of 1946, they risked losing everything. Their courageous action was the first organized strike by teachers in the nation's history. Frustrated with falling down classrooms and a lack of textbooks and other basic materials, the St. Paul teachers called it a strike for better schools. Though their action was illegal, the teachers won many of their goals and kept their jobs. One reason the St. Paul strike succeeded was public pressure. City officials were embarrassed by the massive media coverage the walkout received. The state's two teacher organizations, MEA and MFT, both came to realize that to further their goals, they needed to shape the public debate about education. Along with a growing use of the media, that meant getting involved in recruiting and endorsing candidates for public office. It meant lobbying in government at both the state and local levels. Other unions were recognizing the connection between union activity and political action. United Auto Workers President Walter Reuther noted, "There's a direct relationship between the ballot box and the bread box. What the union fights for and wins at the bargaining table can be taken away in the legislative halls." In Minnesota, union members and farmers took their advocacy a step further, forming the Farmer Labor Party, one of the most successful third-party movements in U.S. history. Farmer labor leaders like Governor Floyd B. Olson guided Minnesota through the difficult years of the Great Depression and created a legacy of support for working families and public education that continues today. In the 1940s, teachers developed a strong and lasting relationship with a young Minneapolis mayor named Hubert Humphrey, who went on to become a U.S. Senator and Vice President under Lyndon Johnson.
The history of the labor movement needs to be taught in every school in this land. We need to know our roots.
As more decisions affecting the future of schools were being made in Congress and at the state capitol, educators campaigned for candidates who supported public education and built relationships with elected officials who shared their convictions. Union members also started to run for office themselves. Today, many Education Minnesota members serve in local elected office, in the Minnesota legislature, and in Congress. Political action paid off when Minnesota teachers won legislation providing tenure, first in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth, then in districts in greater Minnesota. Teacher retirement plans were established. In 1953, Minneapolis teachers became the first in the nation to have transfer and grievance policies. But progress was slow, and pay remained low compared to other professions. Educators still had no legal right to organize and to bargain with school districts. In the period after World War II, both the MFT and MEA grew, but school boards and administrators retained power over almost everything affecting teachers' lives. In 1968, faced with growing pressure from the MEA, the legislature passed the Meet and Confer Act. That law required school boards to negotiate wages and working conditions with teachers. In the 3 years it was in effect, teacher salaries in Minnesota rose almost 70%. But the Meet and Confer process was flawed. Those shortcomings became abundantly clear in 1970 when Minneapolis teachers were forced to strike. Their walkout is often viewed as the final spur to passage of the Minnesota Public Employment Labor Relations Act. Adopted in 1971, PELRA is one of the strongest laws for public employees in the nation. Among other provisions, PELRA gives educators the right to strike. In 1973, the Hermantown Federation of Teachers staged the first legal teacher strike in Minnesota. Numerous other walkouts occurred in the 1970s and into the early 1980s as educators exercised this new right to withhold their labor.
Yesterday, nearly 900 of them took to the streets. The first teacher strike in Minnesota this year, the first ever in Rochester.
For the first time ever, Spring Lake Park's 260 teachers are on strike.
Since the early 1970s, local unions have engaged in more than 20 rounds of bargaining that have literally changed the face of labor management relations. Today's educators are accustomed to a structured process that results in a written contract. Contracts govern not only wages and benefits, but also professional development and educational quality. Today's contracts build on the success of the bargaining that began to take place on a regular basis after the passage of PELRA. Progress for teachers was accompanied by a renewed commitment to public education in the form of what became known as the Minnesota Miracle. Under the Minnesota Miracle, the state would shoulder a greater share of the cost for schools. That would take the burden off property taxpayers and provide a basic level of funding for all school districts, regardless of property value. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter signed into law a bill creating the U.S. Department of Education. Both national teacher organizations, AFT and NEA, were instrumental in its passage. Those years also meant a move toward greater equity for all, regardless of gender, race, or ethnic background. Until the early 1960s, male teachers, considered the head of household, could be paid more than female teachers. And even into the 1970s, a pregnant teacher was expected to resign, with no guarantee of being rehired after having her baby. In some areas, married couples were not allowed to teach in the same school district. For many years, male and female teachers were in separate union locals. Members of the MFT and MEA fought to change these practices. Today, Education Minnesota continues its efforts to advance social justice and challenge institutionalized discrimination. In the 1970s, both MEA and MFT began organizing paraprofessionals and school-related staff. They knew that all school workers deserve fair salaries and appropriate working conditions. Contracts began to reflect the need for high standards for classroom aides and other education professionals, as well as teachers. Today, these educators form an important part of Education Minnesota. Also in the 1970s, MFT and MEA members began to question the need for two competing organizations to represent educators. Leaders of both groups began discussing how to end the competition between them and move toward merger. The first steps toward unification took place at the local level. In 1992, the Rosemount Federation of Teachers and the Rosemount Education Association combined to form the Dakota County United Educators. Their leadership paved the way for more mergers in other local school districts and in higher education. In 1994, MEA and MFT technical college units formed the United Technical College Educators. 4 years later, on September 1st, 1998, MFT and MEA merged to become Education Minnesota, one of the largest unions in the state. Education Minnesota is a first-of-its-kind organization affiliated with both the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Education Minnesota is also an important part of the broader labor movement through its membership in the AFL-CIO.
You build a wall, we'll build a ladder.
Since the merger, Education Minnesota has become a preeminent source of information on education issues, a powerful voice in politics, and most important, an advocate for the professional educators and students of Minnesota. Education might not seem very political, but it is. The work environments, resource allocations, funding levels, policies, and mandates for education are all decided by politicians at the state and national level. This means that Education Minnesota must maintain a presence at the state capitol, making sure that educator and student voices are heard throughout the decision-making process. Education Minnesota works with both the NEA and the AFT to ensure that educators are heard on a national level. Education Minnesota's Political Action Committee, or PAC, works to elect pro-public education candidates to all Minnesota elected offices. The PAC's resources and activism have also helped local school districts across the state win funding referendums, building levies, and school board elections. Funding for schools has always been a struggle, and it affects every aspect of our members' lives, from classroom resources to salaries and benefits. Fighting for adequate, equitable, and sustainable funding at all levels remains a large part of Education Minnesota's political work. State government has often taken money away from education to pay other bills. This was especially true in the early 2000s. After Governor Mark Dayton was elected in 2010, education was made a priority and funding was increased every year he was in office. Politics matters, but education funding is just part of the battle. Anti-bullying curriculum, health insurance, teacher preparation and licensure, teacher development and evaluations, alternative compensation and pensions, these have all dominated the conversations between lawmakers and educators at the state capitol. Education Minnesota focuses on these issues too. Sometimes it takes years to secure important change. Education Minnesota started advocating for all-day, everyday kindergarten in the mid-1990s. Thanks to our work, Governor Dayton finally signed a bill into law in 2013 that created a fully funded program for every district. None of these accomplishments can happen without the active involvement of our members. It is our real, collective voice that matters. The good news is that member activism continues to rise. The number of educators attending lobby days, testifying on bills, writing and calling their legislators, and working on candidate campaigns increases each year. Education Minnesota leaders and members often had to speak up to remind policymakers that students and schools are more than just test scores and rating systems. How schools are measured is one of the most contentious and political issues of our time. Powerful interests with different agendas are involved. Governors, U.S. presidents, Minnesota education commissioners, and U.S. secretaries of education have all come and gone, each with their own ideas on measuring schools effectively. But our union, in cooperation with the AFT and NEA, has been a consistent voice, putting students, educators, and education first. Powerful interests work diligently to undermine the collective voice of workers and working professionals. In the face of attacks on unions, Education Minnesota remains a strong organization working on behalf of professional educators and a strong ally in the fight for workers' rights. When the Minnesota legislature took up a bill in 2012 to put right-to-work language on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, our union was there in the trenches. The swift and strong opposition by our union and our allies killed the bill after only one hearing. Education Minnesota has consistently joined the fight to keep public sector unions strong and collective bargaining rights intact for all working people. While rallies, lobby days, and get out the vote campaigns are crucial to our success, just as important is how the public views the issues of the day. A public voice for educators is essential. To help publicize the efforts of the union and its members and sway public opinion on education issues, in 2006, Education Minnesota launched statewide paid advertising campaigns. It produced TV ads, online banner ads, online videos, social media posts, and sponsorships. The powerful impact of the media campaigns has been clear. Public and member polling has consistently shown increased support for Minnesota's public schools and Education Minnesota's mission. Sound research also influences policy debates. In 2015, Education Minnesota started EPIC, the Educator Policy Innovation Center. It brings together teams of educators to produce academic research papers and outline proposals on topics like student testing, pre-K, teacher recruitment and retention, as well as full-service community schools. Our union also continues to grow its professional development offerings, from courses on classroom management to union-focused training, from racial equity work to growing the next generation of union leaders. And Education Minnesota's own foundation has granted millions of dollars to hundreds of projects that directly improve teaching and learning. Education Minnesota's student program focuses on developing future leaders at Minnesota's colleges and universities. Through institutional chapters and a statewide council, the program works to make sure future educators have the support they need to graduate and succeed in their careers. Early career educators also get needed support through Next Gen Ed Men, a group for those who have been in the education profession for less than 15 years. Education support professionals are the union's fastest growing group of members. To honor the important work of these dedicated school employees, Education Minnesota created an ESP of the Year award in 2008. It is important that all people within our membership feel supported and valued. Through the Ethnic Minority Affairs Committee and the Educators of Color Forums, Education Minnesota has worked to make sure people of color not only go into education, but feel valued and stay in the profession. Education Minnesota has continued to build strength through internal unity and cooperation, while bringing new members into the union. As one example, the Minnesota Community College Faculty Association and the United Technical College Educators came together to form the Minnesota State College Faculty. MSCF has created a stronger voice for faculty at all of the state's community and technical colleges. Education Minnesota also has worked to organize charter schools where educator voices are often not heard and where students suffer due to lack of structural support. Education Minnesota and its members face an uncharted future. Leaders and members will need to think differently and forge new and stronger relationships to maintain the powerful voice our union has built over more than 2 decades. The story of Education Minnesota has always been one of individual educators, people who made the choice to get involved, who fight to make public education stronger, who speak out to elevate our collective voice, and who exercise their rights to act together. As always, the heart and soul of the union rests in our members, on the front lines, fighting for what is best for our students, for our classrooms, and for our communities.
You build a wall, we'll build a ladder. You falling leaves, dead from the branch. Hide in the dark, and we'll light a fire. You build a wall, we'll build a bridge. We'll build a bridge.